Well, welcome everyone. We are looking forward to this panel that we've got coming up, and welcome everyone also for the Food for Fairness Summit. My name is Erica Bjork. I'm going to be your moderator today, and I'm excited about the panel that we've got with us. First and foremost, before we get started, we know we have a 2-hour time period here. So by all means, you got to take breaks, do whatever you need to do. We're going to take a break about halfway through for ourselves. So just keep that in mind. Second, we really want to make this very much a conversation and interactive. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and the Q&A section. We're going to do multiple stops and breaks to take your questions for our panelists. So don't feel like there won't be a time that you can ask a direct question, a follow-up, or similar to that. And so with that, again, we're looking forward to talking a little bit about the economic perspective of our local food systems. And keeping in mind with that, we say local. Not everything is local anymore. We're going to get into a little bit of some of the context to that and the history that goes into it. We're also going to discuss the global influences and drivers that create constraints, incentives, and disincentives for our local level food producers, distributors, and consumers. And obviously, in doing this, we're also going to take a look at how this has an economic influence on our local economies, how it policy influences that, and obviously how the impacts of economics and equity impact our communities. So with that, let's start with our panel. I'm going to have each of them give a little introduction and share a little bit about themselves. But Lon, why don't we start off with you?
Erica, thank you very much and good afternoon. Let me first of all thank the organizers, the Yellow Food Bank, for putting together this great summit. I'm very much pleased to be able to join you, especially along with my colleagues today with Freeman and Aaron. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. Very quickly, my background is kind of an interesting one. I'm a third-generation farmer from Yuba and Butte counties. I then went on to head up 2 different agencies at USDA. I was the administrator of the Agricultural Marketing Service and then the Foreign Ag Service. And then I came back to California where I was the Secretary of Technology, Trade and Commerce. I'm currently the president and CEO of the Hatamia Group, which is an economic strategy consulting firm in Davis, California. And I do a lot of work in food systems and food security issues and economic development across not only this country, but globally. So I'm, again, very pleased to join you today.
Well, thank you, Lon. We are looking forward to the conversation as well. With Lon is also Aaron Smith, Deloach Professor of Agricultural Economics, Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at UC Davis. Aaron, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Erica. So I think I win the prize for coming from the farthest away. I grew up in New Zealand. I grew up on a farm. We were predominantly raised sheep, but we also did some cropping as well. I came to the United States about 25 years ago to study for a PhD in economics at UC San Diego. I then joined the faculty here at UC Davis in 2001. And I've been here as a professor in agricultural and resource economics ever since. I am also now a cluster lead in the AI Institute for the Food System, which is something that also we will talk a little about today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron. And last but not least, we're talking a lot about our local food, local ag. And I think with that, we've got Freeman Barsotti, who is the co-owner of Capay Organic, or your Farm Fresh to You. And Freeman, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And thanks, everybody, for having me on this panel. So Freeman Barsotti, we have a farm, Capay Organic, right here in Yolo County. And I was born and raised on the farm, off to Cal Poly for an ag engineering degree, and then came back and really worked to scale the home delivery. And so Farm Fresh to You is a service delivered right to people's homes, but really focuses on a local first approach in that. And we've been around long enough to kind of see from a producer's perspective how customers' preferences have changed over time and what led to our growth and kind of what happened with COVID as well. So I really look forward to getting more in depth.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Freeman. And we're going to dive in here. And maybe before we can talk a little bit about, with some of the economies of our food system, we really need to talk a little brief background on our food system. So maybe Lon and Aaron, if I can look to you, can you talk a little bit about what our food system looks a little bit like today and give a context to our audience?
Yeah, maybe maybe I can start and then
Great.
Lon can step in. I mean, I am actually going to share some slides here. When you're an academic, I guess this is kind of your natural state is to be presenting charts and graphs. So what I'm showing here is the percentage of food that is produced domestically around the world. So this is data that comes from the FAO at United Nations. And what they do is they look at every country and they total up the total amount of food that's consumed, and then they total out the total amount of food that crosses borders. So it's exported or imported. And so what you can see is that in the 1990s, about 75 to 80% of food, that's the red line, was produced domestically. The rest was imported from a different country. And you can see that that percentage has declined over time. And so in 2019, which is the last year, I think in these data, 2018 or 19, it was more like 65% or less than 65% of food was produced domestically. So the percentage of our food that's consumed around the world has increased, that is exported and imported has changed and declined over a lot over time. So food is becoming less local. One thing we can see is that a lot of this change is happening in fruits and vegetables, especially over the last decade. So that blue line shows us that we've seen quite a dramatic drop in the percentage of fruit and vegetables that are grown locally. These patterns differ around the world. So here I'm showing 4 continents. If we look at Asia, a very high percentage of food that is consumed in Asia is produced within the countries in Asia. So what we're looking at here is not trade that goes from continent to continent, but trade that's happening within countries on a continent. So when we're looking at particular countries, we see that, for example, in Europe, there's been a dramatic decline in the amount of food that's produced domestically in Europe. European countries are now importing a lot more food than they used to. And we see, throughout the world, we see declines in the amount of food that's produced domestically. So our food system is becoming much more global. The United States, so same data, but now we're looking at the US. And so what we see is same thing. Since 1990, the percentage of our food, and all of these numbers, I should say, are measured in dollar value, because you always have this question about food. How do I add pineapples to potatoes to steak? And so these food items are aggregated in dollar terms. And so more than 80% of our food budget was produced domestically in the United States in 1990. That percentage is now down to 65%. We can see that the biggest change has happened on the fruit and vegetable side. So cereals, the United States is an exporter of the major grains, and so imports very little. So most of the grain that is consumed in the United States is produced domestically. But for fruit and vegetables, we all know now we can go to the store, we can get grapes from Chile or avocados from Mexico. We have a lot more fruit and vegetables in particular being imported. One more comment on localness, and then I'll step back. Is when we think about local food and the percentage of food that is grown close to where we live versus far away, that's much easier to do in some places than others. And I think when we're sitting here in California, what I'm showing on this picture here is how big is California relative to the whole country? Well, it's 10 to 15% of US population, 10 to 15% of US GDP. But California produces a lot of fruit and vegetables in particular. So not so much grains, but a lot in fruit and vegetables in particular. So 100% of the almonds in the country effectively, more than 80% of the broccoli or carrots or grapes in the country are produced in California. So if we want to consume these goods locally, we can do that because they're grown here. When you are living in other parts of the country, you may have less access to nutritious locally grown food purely because of the climate. So I'm going to stop there and I'll.
Aaron, yes. Erica, if I could kind of add to that and put a little flavor to the local production and consumption. Aaron laid out very nicely how the global markets are affecting how we consume food and certainly how we produce food. I've done a number of studies, most recently for SACOG, which is the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. So it's a 6-county region that surrounds our capital. So when we're talking about local, this is very specific to data. This is a little dated information, but I think it's pretty accurate. There's almost 1.5 million acres of farmland in these 6 counties, and with more than 7,200 farms and ranches of all different sizes. So we have some of the largest ranchers and farmers to some of the smallest in our region. That production of farmers and ranchers produces over 150 crops, totaling about 3.4 million tons of production in our 6-county region. So again, very localized. The farm gate value of that is about $2 billion. So it's a huge impact upon our local economy that most people probably don't really realize that live in this region. And an estimated about $3.4 billion annually in output in overall agriculture and food industry cluster value chain, which employs about 37,000 workers across our 6-county region. Now, one of the misnomers is that local food, if we produce it here, you must consume it here as well, too. Well, we consume about 1.9 million tons of food, but based upon estimates that we've done in our analysis, only about 2% of that comes from local sources. So there's a huge opportunity for local production to be consumed. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. So much of what we produce is then further processed, sent out from the region, may come back and consumed here, but it's not consumed directly off the farms in our local communities. So that produces an opportunity, an economic opportunity to really expand that in a huge way and have an impact upon not only the growers, but an impact upon consumers as well.
So Lon and Aaron, maybe before we get to the more hyper-local, which I know is the key focus for today, and the economics and the impact, maybe Aaron, going back to, you look at those initial charts and you see how gradually, and you talk about how, especially the fruits and vegetables. So for the consumer, that would probably be a little surprising. You would think fruits and vegetables, those are the things I need most local, or I need most readily, or I don't want shipped across the world. Can you speak a little bit to, and again, Lon, jump in here as well, like why are we seeing that chart continually to go down, knowing that not just our region, but our country does have an abundance of farmland and agriculture?
I think some of it is seasonality. And so, you go back 20 or 30 years, you would eat things when they were in season. So when something is growing locally, it comes to the store, and that's when you eat it. And when it gets to be a different season, you eat a different food. And now we expect, and we have the luxury of being able to consume whatever particular fruit and vegetables we like all year round, because they can be shipped from other places in the world where the growing season is different. So I think that's part of it. I think there've been improvements in shipping technology that's able to maybe preserve quality better than they used to. I mean, I think we all feel like we like the taste of sort of local strawberries and produce better than those that have been shipped from across the world, and I think that's right. But the produce that comes from other parts of the world is better quality maybe now than it would have been 20 years ago.
Lon, is there anything else to this besides just the consumer preference that I just decide I want strawberries in January, or I've got to have my avocados year round, that have really started to drive some of these kind of global impacts, which ultimately are affecting our local markets as well?
Absolutely. It's all due to global government policy in terms of open and freer markets, globalization. I mean, we're consuming products from countries we never thought we would import products from, and we're sending products into countries we never thought we would export to as well. So it's free trade. When I was again, official with USDA, I worked on NAFTA and other free trade agreements around the world. That opened up markets, but it also opened up the US market to those products as well. And as we're talking about the economics, and I know that Professor Smith will talk to this much better than I can, it's all about supply and demand. So where the cost of these products are more affordable, they're going to move in that direction where people are going to afford to pay for them. So that's certainly been the case in globalization, for better and for worse in many communities. And I think we're going to talk about equity and sustainability in a minute, but that's certainly an issue when it comes to food policy as well.
Can you give some examples on a little bit on the food policy side and how, again, it keeps continuing to drive these global markets? I know you've been talking kind of big picture here, but maybe even diving down a little bit and giving a specific example.
Well, a specific example is NAFTA. I mean, I think NAFTA opened up the markets. Aaron mentioned getting avocados from Mexico. Who would ever have thought of that 20 years ago? The phytosanitary food safety issues were not standardized, so we didn't import a lot of food from a lot of other countries. But now we go into our supermarkets and buy Chilean grapes, buy Mexican produce. A lot of the strawberries we consume come from Mexico as well too. So I think that the standardization that we are seeing now is allowing us to see this global trade going back and forth. I was in a produce market in Vancouver a number of years ago, and the vast majority of some of the fresh produce there was from China. We don't allow that in here because of a number of phytosanitary regulatory issues, but Canada does. And there's a vast amount. Most of the apples in this produce market were from China. So that is the change that I think we're seeing very specifically. But again, I think that there are other issues like the pandemic that we're faced with, supply chain, that I think we'll get to just in a minute, that impact that as well.
Yes, I think we've all been getting a economic study and supply chain as of late. And we will dive into that a little bit more. But before we kind of move away from like just again where we're currently at, the current food system, our region's also known as a big provider for, and I think again, in keeping the bigger context, when we talk about fruits and vegetables and moving food, it's not just the tomato that you might find in the produce section, right? I believe Blue Diamond, their biggest business is more the almonds going in as ingredients than actually selling almonds directly to consumers. So maybe, and this is again to Freeman, or we might have you jump in a little bit. Can you talk about, again, both that play that has in the global system, whether it's locally or bigger of, again, this is not necessarily whole peppers, but does the use of food now more and more in kind of this production setting and ingredient setting have an impact as well as what we're seeing around the world?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One challenge is, for us, we need that premium price because the reality is we've heard about the economics right here is things are flowing to where they're produced most cheaply. And with Mexico opening up, labor's a couple bucks a day. We cannot compete with that. And so for us, we have to have that connection with the consumer to be able to get a higher price. And it's for good reason. If they understand the family of employees, the great benefits here as a base requirement in California, workers' compensation, mandatory health insurance, all of these are good things, but they're expensive. And so if you can communicate that story and connect with that customer, you could command that premium. The challenge is it's hard enough when we're selling whole fruits and vegetables right to people with the story, and they can call us up right to the contact center, right? When you think about these inputs in food products, it gets even more challenging. Cool country of origin labeling, Lon, you probably know all about it, but it gets pretty crazy, right? Oh, the cow was growing here and the calf was over here, and then it was packaged over there. Well, that goes away when you think about produce as an ingredient in food service, and it gets really difficult to really understand what even is local as it goes into 1-2 levels of food processing. So I think you really do even lose the ability to see, and then it really does come down to price, i.e. less local produced where it's most efficient.
Yeah, I don't think we're seeing a lot of sourcing if you go through to a fast food kind of restaurant and ordering French fries, so to speak. Which again, and maybe just before we kind of start getting more into some of the current context, just looking just backwards just a second too, from what I'm hearing from all of you as the experts in the room, okay, it's driven by consumer demand, whether that's a trend of the moment or consumption, or I want something year round. Definitely supply and demand, price, looking for the lowest price, which is driving this, who can produce it the cheapest and probably quickest around the world, which, and again, from a historical context, I think we know as a consumer market in the US, we're always about like, where can we get it the cheapest and the most abundant and everything else. But is that necessarily always been the case for our food systems? I know, and maybe for many folks, when you travel around the world, the price of food tends to be a little higher in some places. And again, whether it's cultivated locally or otherwise, is this just decades and decades, the consumer has just been kind of put in a place that this is what they want, knowing that, some of our bigger distributors are able to provide it for them? Or is this kind of the standard now everywhere in the world?
I think the trends are moving in the same direction throughout the world. I remember you spent a year on the East Coast 20 years ago, and produce in the grocery stores was pretty terrible there. I mean, it was I was spoiled coming first from where I grew up in New Zealand, where either in the store or what we grew at home was good, and then living in California during graduate school, and then going to the East Coast, and it was terrible. And now that's no longer true there. And I think if you go to Europe or you go to other parts of the world, I think the same is true. So, I think the trends are moving in the same direction throughout the world.
And I would just add to what Erin has just said, we've become a non-agrarian society, not only in this country, but globally. And so people at one point bought food that they ate food that they produce.
Yeah.
We don't do that often anymore. And I think that has certainly shifted, consumer preferences. And, a lot of people think they just go into the store and they buy it off the shelf. And that's where food comes from. And that's part of the challenge. I mean, Freeman sees that, I'm sure, all the time in his markets. But this is what, we have to do as policymakers and local producers and folks that are focused on a local community. How do we do a better job of educating consumers that local produce and local fruits and vegetables that Erin has talked about are better for you? Yep. I mean, they're fresher, they're going to taste better. And so that's part of the challenge that I think we're faced with.
Yeah, I think that's the other side of the same coin. Lon mentioned that most people are disconnected from agriculture, and that's because agriculture has become so efficient. We can produce so much food at such a low price that we don't need very many people working in that. So that naturally brings the good thing, which is low prices for consumers, but it also brings that separation from the way food is grown, and it commoditizes food, which is the world we're living in, I think.
And I think the education thing is absolutely true. And it's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, it's really difficult to really sync with customers and help them understand. So it really is kind of a dangerous battle to go into a marketing plan where your plan is based on the successful education of consumers, right? It's just really darn hard. But in addition to the health benefits that Lon mentioned, it's also, our customers really respond to the community aspect, right? Keeping those dollars local. It's not just the health of the food, but those dollars are going into local communities, supporting local, businesses that help farms, people who are then spending in those communities. That's another big angle that people appreciate on the local scene.
So let's talk about where we're at locally, and probably very much in the context to these last few years. I want to remind our audience too, if you have direct questions for our panel, please put them in the chat. We would be more than willing to address them for you, get you some additional details, follow-ups and similar. And kind of going back to a little bit of what you were saying to Freeman and Lon on just the importance of local, knowing where your food comes from, all those kinds of key and important things. I think, this past year, we've all been dealing with a little bit more, we'll say, self-education on, again, where everything comes from our supply chains and similar. Freeman, you've probably been dealing with this the most. Do you want to just kind of start us off a little bit with the impact that the pandemic has had on you these last years and a half, and what we're seeing kind of come out of it, both for the state of your business, but also for the local economy?
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting because since 2015 was kind of the peak, right, where everybody was really into local, or at least for us, into local CSAs, community supported agriculture, delivering produce to people's door was really in, and we saw that kind of wane. And with COVID, it was really interesting to see firsthand how things changed. Here's an example. With the buying, everybody's buying everything. Stores couldn't get enough supply, but that didn't mean, say, a salsa maker in Oakland didn't have the supply. But historically, everybody shipped it through a distributor here in SAC, UNFI, for example. Well, UNFI, I mean, they're working 24 hours a day. Everybody's wiped out. And now you have truckloads of salsa in Oakland. You have shelves with empty stores with empty shelves, no salsa, and a distributor that is completely broken down. And so for us, with those relationships with the farm contacts, you can reach out and say, hey, and then we have the direct customer connection. We were really able to kind of grab that product and get it and kind of bypass the traditional food supply system, but it just broke. And you don't think about things, but just eggs, right? Like March 12th, pre-COVID, before people panicked, everybody's at the office, Airbnb has their kitchen and they feed all their employees and they're buying all these eggs, local free range eggs. It's great, but that's all in food service, right? And then instantly, no more going to work, no more going to restaurants. All these food service eggs that are packaged in trays are now just sitting in the warehouse. And so to be able to get those and kind of package them into a retail unit, it sounds easy, but it just takes a little bit of time for the machine to kind of refocus from a food service world to a retail world. And so for us, it was just really interesting to see these breakdowns firsthand and to be able to kind of utilize the connections and the relationships that we've developed to grab that product and then directly get it to customers. That was our main experience through the kind of the panic piece of COVID.
Lon and Aaron, maybe one of you can jump in here. I know one of the key things, especially we talk about right now with supply chain, and this is across the board in our economy of, we run things lean and mean. And I think for anyone who's tied to our ag community, they would attest to that, you don't have a huge, profit margin to work from. And so in doing so, you lots of times you don't necessarily have some of those backup processes, systems, distribution, whatever it might be when some of these disruptions kind of take place. Is this, again, just the way that our food systems and similar have gone, where they've kind of been going in one direction, and thus when these disruptions happen, we just don't have the flexibility to really get the food where it needs to be?
Well, I think Freeman highlighted that very, very well. One of the other things that COVID brought, and it exacerbated the labor supply that agriculture has already been faced with even previous to COVID. And because of COVID, it's even just, magnified that and multiplied that enormously, that labor shortage is affecting the supply chain, not only the ability to get the food from the field to the processor, but then to get to the processor to the shelves. And then they may not even have the people to shelve it or use it, as Freeman has said. So that has really been a major impact. We're seeing shortages in drivers. We're seeing shortages just in everyday workers in the food system. So that's been the further challenge that I think we're faced with.
Yeah, and then just to chime in there, Erica, I mean, I think you're right that our sort of global system is, it's a little bit like the freeway. When it's packed with cars and everybody's moving along quickly, it only takes a really little thing to just bring the whole thing to a halt. And that's kind of what happened through COVID. And what's interesting about Freeman's story is that there are some safety valves. So he, with his connections, was able to step in and help a little bit. And there's definitely been a lot of these supply chain issues in the food system. One thing that I'm interested in and that I sense just going to stores and looking at the shelves is that if anything, the food system has been more resilient than other sectors of the economy. And I don't really know why that is, to be honest, but I found that interesting, and maybe these guys will tell me I'm wrong about that, but that's certainly my perception, that you want to buy a bike or a car, and it's really, really hard to do that. but for the most part, especially after the initial sort of panic period, we've been able to buy food, maybe not toilet paper, but food.
Aaron, I think you answered your own question. You had talked about increased efficiencies in agriculture production. I think that's partly due to the fact that it has been less impacted, the food supply, than some of these other supply chains like construction, like toilet paper, like a lot of other things. You're absolutely right.
So Freeman, to that point, and to Aaron's comment, do you have a theory as to why you think food and ag has been a little more resilient than what we've seen with other industries, which I think from a local benefit, and whether or not we actually have some of the data to support this, but has certainly helped our local economy to a degree, knowing how important ag is here in this region.
Well, I really like the picture Aaron drew as a safety valve, right? Because that's the reality. Is I think, yes, COVID happened and people were willing to spend more and really wanted that food, and the infrastructure was out there, right? Think about farmers markets, think about community supported ag, the networks that we've built. We had those networks in place. COVID just forced customers to not be able to go to a Safeway or a Whole Foods or an Instacart, right? And so then they turned to a higher priced alternative that was now bringing enough value to them that they were willing to pay that higher price. And farmers really did step up. And so, I see that as kind of like not a permanent shift per se, but as a safety valve. And there's a lot of folks that did step up and do a great job. But in the long term, I don't know, looking forward, is that really going to be a permanent shift, or are we going to gradually shift back towards that economy of scale where things are just really produced where they're most efficient?
So Freeman, that actually, we did have a question from our audience, which I think kind of goes to your last point of, does this experience, having used these personal connections to deal with supply chain issues, represent a new way of doing business going forward for you and your family?
Well, I think we've always done that, right? And that's why we were able to be that safety valve. So I think there's tons of businesses out there that's just kind of the way they do things, right? They have local connections. They're all about local, but they're always going to be a little bit higher priced. And so I don't think it's going to be a permanent shift. Personally, I think it's a shift and a wake up call, and people are like, whoa, this food chain thing is important, and kind of was reminded by that, as they were in 2000, right? When technology allowed them to break the old chain of going to the grocery store and buying iceberg lettuce, right? And kind of do all these new things that we've seen in the California food scene and really the national food scene. So I think they've always been there, and they're just not a huge piece of the market share. And with these breakdowns, that overflow was able to be picked up by them. But no, I just don't know if permanently, yes, they're always going to have those connections and be able to do that. But I don't know if it's going to lead to more market share per se permanently.
Freeman, you talked a few times about how, and I'm sure the word is a little overused now, just pivoting, but, you were able to get your product to the market, whether it be directly to consumers or to more kind of industrial buyers, whatever that might look like, based on your networks, your relationships. In talking to a lot of producers, that was very similar. Like, a lot of them started at a farmer's market, and then they ended up having, one contract and one large relationship. And then that got canceled once COVID set in, and then they were back at the farmer's market. Do you find especially our local food system, is this continued just to be a local loose network of personal relationships? Or is there, in going back to how, strengthening those local economies, is there a stronger kind of network that is needed as we face what could be maybe that next disruption?
I mean, I think we stepped up. I mean, this COVID thing was a pretty big deal. And so I don't know if more or stronger networks, or maybe you're even hinting at policy that forces these networks. I don't know if that would help or is needed, because I do feel like people reacted pretty well. But it is a wake-up call, right? And it is interesting, but it costs more, right? It costs more. And I think these relationships, and you think about a food bank, you think about these relationships, you think about producers, people do care about the communities that they're in. And so, working together and really building that system and connection where food is flowing between consumers who are willing to pay a little bit more and all these organizations. I think that's where that emphasis on building networks needs to be, because these folks are in here, COVID or not, or the next big scare or not. And that's really the key to sustainability, is the people who are in and committed day in, day out, without, a need for, oh man, my cheaper alternative has broken down and now I'm knocking on the door.
Well, and maybe Aaron, not that we're saying anything against the bike makers, but certainly it sounds like, and I think Freeman's an example of both the resilience and the relationships that come from our local ag community, whether it's Yolo County within our 6-county region, that are probably the reason we did still have food and ag on our shelves, very much to a degree, let alone it, continues to be a in-demand item, right? At the end of the day, you've got to eat one way or another. So it is something that has to continue to grow. I think we have one more question for you, and I'm just going to ask it right now, Freeman. Lon, you had been talking a little bit about, let's see here, more of that local process, how it adds value for products grown here, local consumption. Can you talk about that more? And whether not just in current context, but again, in that bigger picture of our local economy?
Yeah, absolutely. What I was talking about is, in order to increase our local consumption of locally grown products, we have to grow for what's locally demanded, right? So we were talking about policies locally. There have been a number of institutional buyers that are looking to do buy local. For example, the University of California system, Cal State University system, all have buy local mandates by 2025, I think. But their buy local goes out to like 250 miles. We could do a better job of that, especially in our region. It could be 50 miles and supply that. So with that sort of policy change, we could certainly change the demand calculus within the local community. I mentioned we produce over 300 different crops in the local 6-county region. Well, some of them are very small numbers. We can increase those numbers, especially in the fresh fruits and vegetables, for local consumption. And that would certainly afford growers a better market locally, because now if they grow it, they don't sell it here because they don't have buyers. Another local institutional buying system is the restaurant owners and schools. If local schools institute policies that they have to buy a certain amount of locally grown product, that just drives up the demand for that. And it gets to I think what we're going to talk about in our second hour of today is about equity. We talked about people, and Freeman said folks are thinking about they'll pay a higher price. Those are the folks that can afford to pay a higher price. How about the communities in our locales that can't afford to pay higher prices? How do they access more affordable, healthy foods? And I think that's a movement for local policymakers to address.
So maybe, Lon, let's dig into that a little bit, since we're talking about local and food and economics and policy. So on the policy side, is it a matter of just whether it is regional, state leaders need to pass ordinances that say a certain percentage has to be buy local? Is that literally just what we need to do? Or, and to Freeman, I would also answer to that, are our local producers and growers in a place also to supply sometimes these large quantities or demands that a UC Davis or similar might have, right? Where they're, so Lon, you could dig into that a little bit. It's easy to say, I think the policy is just, we'll buy local, but what does that policy actually look like, right?
That's a simple policy that you could mandate, but the big but is, do we have the systems in place to provide that? Not only the acreage to produce what's demanded, but do we have the processing and distribution channels to make that happen? That's the challenge that I think we don't currently have, because we've gone away to shipping everything we produce to outside processors somewhere else.
Yep.
And so I think that that's an issue that we have to address. For example, there are really no slaughterhouses locally in a lot of in the 6-county region. So if we're looking at protein production, how do you do that locally? You really can't do that locally.
Yep.
So that's part of the challenge in establishing really the foundation of getting the food from the field into the consumers that really need it. And there's a lot of different steps that go along with that. And not only the distribution aspect, but the processing aspect as well.
And
So-
I'd say, oh, go ahead, Freeman. I'll go next.
Yeah, and I think producers will step up, but I don't want to be like, oh, people are buying from other places. It's real. Like, let's just take strawberries, for example. We grow strawberries, you till the field, you make the beds, you put all the stuff into it, and then you plant the plants, and then they grow. And we have beautiful strawberries in April and May, and it gets hot and they're toast, and the quality goes down, and it's a nightmare, and they're delicious, but they're just gone. And so the same inputs in Watsonville, for example, they're producing berries for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. You can't, that's a lot of energy, a lot of input, a lot of environmental things we could discuss to grow an acre of berries. Does it make sense that we're growing them here in Yolo County? It's a fair question, right? And then so I think, yes, producers will step up, and yes, there are plenty of things that we can grow. And I'd even push the culinary folks at the UC system, right? You don't have to make the same thing 52 weeks a year. We could all shift back to eating with the seasons and actually look at what's out there and then cater the menu to that. So I think there's a lot of shifts that would need to happen to get there. But yeah, I do think if the price is there, because it is a little bit less efficient, local producers will step up. But it is a challenge, right? Because quality, food safety, all of these things are absolutely essential in this mainstream supply of fresh fruits and vegetables. You can't just magically pull that off and make good arrivals down at UC San Diego or wherever you're suddenly shipping produce.
Yeah, I really like the points Freeman made there. Yeah, I'd be very wary about buy local mandates in general. So we're at a point where the food is coming from the place where it's cheapest to produce, and so the question we have to ask ourselves is what are we getting if we're going to then force entities to buy more expensive food? And so if we're forcing state-funded entities to buy more expensive food, then we're making decisions about tax dollars that we need to think about. If we are forcing maybe lower income individuals in particular to buy certain types of food that's more expensive, then that's also something we need to think about. So there's potential benefits to localness that we may talk about later in terms of community building, in terms of we can think about it and think about environmental issues, which can cut both ways. And if you're getting something from paying more in order to have it from local, then by all means. But I think we want to be wary about sort of blanket mandates that may have a lot of other sort of unforeseen costs.
Well, and maybe in that respect, we're throwing the word local around quite a bit here. Maybe for the context of our audience too, like what are you defining as local? Is that 30 miles, 120 miles, state of California? What does that look like to you as the experts?
Well, I guess it depends upon where you're sitting in terms of locality. Freeman made a very good point about geographic production. There's a reason why we only consume 2% of what we grow here, is because oftentimes it's more efficient to grow lettuce in the Salinas Valley than it is to do it here. It's more efficient to grow strawberries in Oxnard and in Watsonville than it is to grow it here. So I think that's the issue. So if that's local, In some definition, that's a possibility. But there are, as Freeman said, other opportunities that we can grow locally here that will benefit not only the growing side, but also the consumer side. It's always better to have your food closer to where you consume it for food safety reasons, for freshness, for health reasons, for many different things. So I know that there are different definitions of local, but here in California, I think as Professor Smith highlighted initially, we should be able to consume most of what we grow in a good way in California. So maybe that's the locality issue we're talking about.
And for us, I think, I can't tell you how many hours I've spent talking about the definition of local. It's really hard. And for us, we never put a line in the sand on some miles because it actually doesn't, it's too hard. And what I think is it's really about local, like Lon said, local as possible and kind of blending, hey, look, we have a great broccoli crop that's going to make arrivals. Let's hammer that. Let's get that to people. Let's use it. Let's really use as much as we can locally because now is the time and we have the production, all pistons firing. Let's get after it. And then if you get a ton of volume of really close stuff, maybe, pears aren't here yet. Cortland, we have some, and maybe you can go to Oregon or Washington to get pears and have a decent selection for the top of the salad. But when you look at your whole plate, when you look at it kind of this local philosophy, this local sourcing philosophy, doing a pretty darn good job with 70% or your average food miles are feeling good. And I think, that's what's hard is everybody kind of wants to just pick a number. And then you hear some numbers. Whole Foods had one a while ago. It was like an 8-hour semi drive or something. And it's like, oh man, that's terrible. But it is actually quite hard. And so, for us, we always think about local as possible and really making sure the mix is the best the region has to offer while still hitting quality, food safety, and reasonable pricing.
So I think, Lon, you had just mentioned a minute ago, what is it, 2% of our regional ag production stays here locally, essentially. So what's grown in our fields, we're similar to our plates one way or shape or another. Do we know what the economic impact would be if we even raised that, if we even doubled that to 4%, to 10%? What does it look like? And I don't know if there's other examples of those regions that are doing it well, that have a strong ag economy, that are returning a lot of that product locally.
I think Aaron and I could probably calculate that for you before too long, but not during the course of this discussion. You absolutely will see a major impact upon the local economy if more of it stays local, because you have a multiplier effect of what the growers are going to be utilizing. They're investing that in equipment and other services. So you're going to see a greater opportunity here locally. If I could, I want to throw another a wrench into this whole discussion, and it has to do with environmental changes. When we're talking about local, we could produce things now here that we couldn't produce maybe 20 years ago because of global warming. I did a study for the Oregon food and beverage industry a couple of years ago. And we did analysis showing they could produce a lot of commodities and crops that they couldn't produce just a decade ago because of the warming nature of the environment in Oregon and the Northwest. So they're not just going to be producing apples and pears. They can produce a lot of fresh produce up there now. So they're looking at more of the local production as well. So that's changing in regions of the world. And I think that the charts that Aaron showed earlier shows that to be the case. Places like Africa and Asia are producing things that they never produced before and are consuming them now. I would imagine if you took a look at those charts a decade ago, they would have been very different. So that's just another issue that I throw out there, that if we're talking about local production and consumption, we may now be able to do it more economically here locally because just of the changing seasons that we have. And I think we're already seeing some of that occurring. Freeman can probably speak to that better than I can, but I know that we're producing things here locally that we never even thought we would be able to produce in the past.
Freeman?
Yeah, I think, water's another huge one, right? So it's not just the climate, it's the resources, the inputs. And, you look at what's happening with the water situation and the subsidence and the irony of that you can't get enough water through the canal because the subsidence has lowered the canal, right? So it's lost 20% of its capacity. And so I think it's not just temperature. I always think avocados, right? We talked about those earlier with Mexico. Well, you can't grow them Haas, at least. You can't really north of San Luis Obispo. The climate's not right. Well, you could probably think about doing that now. If it gets real cold, that would stink, and lose that orchard. But it's not just the temperature, it's also the effects of just having the water there to the clean water, right? You have water with a bunch of salt or boron, as we do in Yolo County, fighting the boron all the time. It becomes difficult to be that world-class, most efficient producer unless you have all the elements together, including climate, including water, including labor, right? You think about labor inputs to execute vegetable crops in Oregon, really hard. And so it really is a complex thing.
Lon, maybe to that point a little bit, and Freeman, your comment on the water, again, if we're talking about what is equitable and sustainable, probably a lot of different ways to look at it. Earlier you talked about it's the yield per acre, right? Is it about our region maximizing the acreage we have now to grow and provide, or is it, not to say producing more with less? And to your point, Freeman, we are losing resources like water and similar. So whether, to continue to support that economy that we have going, what is that continued infrastructure needs to be around it, and how can it also be, I guess, sustainable in that same regard?
I want to turn to Aaron. I know he wanted to jump in on the last subject matter. So,
yeah. So, I mean, I would say one of the most important things, and this is not a specific policy recommendation, but a philosophy is you want to encourage the kind of inventiveness that you see from Freeman and that Lon was talking about among farmers. So if you have the flexibility in agriculture to be able to adapt and grow different crops or explore more different ways of marketing your product, I think encouraging that vitality is a really important objective in terms of economic sustainability. And, because as we've sort of said a few times now, you in our system with a lot of global trade, prices are really low. And so if we're going to do things that make those prices higher, like emphasize local production, then we need to think, well, what are we getting for that? And so I think, one of the big things is one of the big things that leads to, for example, Lon's 2% statistic is a lot of food processing is highly concentrated. There's a big economies of scale in that business. And so those companies often are really big and have a lot of market power. And so they can dictate terms to their suppliers. And so there's a power imbalance there. And one of the ways you can push back on that power imbalance is through various kind of antitrust policy type things. Another way you can do it is to try to just create an environment where sort of inventiveness and entrepreneurial spirit is rewarded. And I think that is that to me is sort of would be more of a focus, I guess, than localness per se, because I don't myself see localness as something that's good in and of itself, but I say, if we're sourcing food locally, like what is the benefit that we're getting, to the community from doing that, rather than that an apple is somehow inherently better if it comes from from Washington State or from local Yolo County or from New Zealand. Sometimes I buy New Zealand apples, but they're not local. but I like them. And so the localness per se, I think should not be our objective, but it should be, what are we getting in terms of a vibrant community, in terms of environmental benefits or costs when we think about these things.
Well, maybe on that note, Aaron, that might be a good opportunity to take a short break here. We're coming up on not quite an hour, and I'm going to guess our panelists wouldn't mind just a quick 5 minutes to, whether it's grab something to drink or anything else. We'll give our audience a chance to do the same, and we will come back here just a little past 2:30. Welcome back, gentlemen. Again, for those of you who, if any of you are joining us just for the first time on the conversation for this panel, we're talking about the equitable, sustainable local food system, the economics of this, what it looks like, equity, and again, really discussing what does local mean. And again, if you are just joining us, we have 3 local experts, as you want to put it, who have are bringing a perspective to all of this. We have Lon Hatamiya. I'm hoping I'm doing that some justice there, Lon, who's with us. Aaron Smith from UC Davis, and our local ag expert on the boots on the ground, so to speak, with Freeman Barsotti. So before we took the break, and I think Aaron, you led off with this really well, of talking about, at the core of this, so we're talking about how we can improve our local economies, have a more sustainable food system tied to our ag community production and similar. Something that might, for some of us, might seem almost striking, but our region as a whole, kind of coming out of COVID, fared much better than many others. A big part of this is we were not reliant on tourism or travel like some other, like a Las Vegas, for example, and similar, to a degree. And to your point, Aaron, food on the shelves helped our region as much as on many kind of local instances, it was definitely hurting some of our producers, our suppliers, our farmers, and certainly when you look at the other end in our food system and our restaurants. But, kind of going back to this, Aaron, when you talk about there are incredible local impacts when you do have kind of the food that's produced here, stays here within the market. Can you expand upon that a little bit and talk through what that looks like and what some of those other kind of benefits can be?
Yeah, I will a little bit, and certainly wait for the other guys to chime in as well. And I think some of those benefits are things that are not economic, and so those I won't sort of talk about as much, but just sort of how we think of a community and as a society and a society as connecting with our neighbors and the people growing our food versus doing these transactions arm's length. So I think a large part of it is stuff that maybe in economics we don't really measure, but are important to sort of the welfare of communities and other things that people care about a lot. So I think those are the things that matter a lot. I think the economic questions are very hard to answer because we can talk potentially about if you were to institute policies that would lead us to be paying more money to local producers to be able to produce food that we consume locally, and that's more money that we're then not spending on other things, and so those trade-offs make the sort of cold hard sort of economic calculations I think often push in the other direction, that when we've got big firms producing things at very low cost, that we're in a position where we have money to be able to spend on other things. But I think we also get to be in a position where maybe we don't quite end up with our sort of communities being organized the way that we would like. And just I'll finish with one economic point that I think is relevant, and it's certainly relevant in the food system, and it's relevant in other parts of the economy too. And that is that there is an imbalance of power in many industries where very large firms and have a lot of power. And in particular, I think it's more in agriculture, it's more prominent sort of on the buy side or the monopsony side, in the sense that processing firms in particular have a lot of power over farmers and the prices they can pay and the terms that they can dictate, because they are so concentrated. And I don't think policy in general has dealt very well with antitrust issues in the last 20 or 30 years, because it's hard to weigh the benefits we get from this big firm producing low cost stuff for consumers versus the sort of lack of, or the reduction in vitality and that you get from sort of suppressing competition.
Well, and maybe, okay, so let's dive in first, maybe a little bit more on the policy side. So, we talked earlier about, does it mean a mandate to buy local, so to speak, to spur more of that local investment or keeping that local product here? From a federal level, I think we had some conversations in prep to this of, it's sometimes you have the carrot or the stick, and a lot of those incentives aren't necessarily for some of the agriculture we see around here, right? It's for other parts of the country, or it's for other products. And I don't think any of us can blame the producer or the farmer or the dairy owner, whoever it might be, of, at the end of the day, when you got to pay the bills, you're gonna go for probably where your product's going to get bought and you've got some sustainability with that. So are there things to a degree, and again, Lon, I'm going to look to you, you're a little bit of the policy person here, that from maybe it's not the local jurisdictions. Is this more of stuff that needs to come from a federal standpoint, that there's policy that could change that would actually incentivize more of our food to stay here within the local market?
I believe that's been done, rather systemically within USDA, for example. There's more emphasis now on specialty crops than there used to be. Most of them, the emphasis was on, the Midwestern grain and sugar and corn. Those kinds of things were getting the major focus. But more recently, there has been more emphasis placed on the federal side, anyhow, in promoting specialty crop production. And where's the epicenter of specialty crop production but California? And so I think we are getting some of the fringes of that support, not only marketing support, but in support for our programs and our crops that are grown in this state. So I think that's one area that can be done and is being done to the extent that it's self-sufficient. Not yet. I don't think it ever will be, because of the political nature of what we're talking about. We only have 2 senators, and small little states in the Midwest have many more. So guess where the decisions are being made on ag policy. So that's a challenge. But because we are so resilient, we are so efficient, we are so productive, California has been able to continue to stay at the forefront of agriculture production. So I'm going to throw out another kind of ominous fact. I read a lot of studies, and I'm sure that my colleagues do as well, that in the next 100 years, we may not have enough arable land to produce the food that we need for the entire world. Well, maybe that's where our university system and in California comes up with the technology to make us more efficient, to better utilize the lessening arable land that we have, not only in California, but globally. And I think that's the policy change that I think we can really effectuate from our perspective in California. We've been so efficient in the past. How do we replicate that, or how do we dictate that to other parts of the country? That's yet to be determined, but certainly that's a policy decision that we should be pursuing. Especially as it relates to food. I mean, I think most people, as we talked earlier, don't necessarily know where their food comes from, but when they don't have it, that's when they're concerned about it. And so that's why I think that policies in these areas are so critical.
So, we are talking about a system here, right? And you've mentioned this a few times of food processing and economies of scale, right? We're very much growing the food, but it's not necessarily being processed here, which makes a big difference, right? And we've lost a lot of those kind of local food processing sites, which we might have had in the past, right? So is that a key function to this? And with that, and we go back to the bigger economics, the bigger sustainability and similar, and maybe, Freeman, you might have some of these examples, during COVID, there were quite a few farmers I spoke to where, to your point, like all of a sudden, their predictable orders just all of a sudden died one day, in the sense that there was not a demand for it. The person that they supplied to on the other side was no longer buying their product. they had something that they wanted to be able to get into the community. People certainly needed food, but they had no way to process it and they had no way to transport it. There's a system here that goes with this. If we are aspiring to drive the local economy greater than just people buying the food and the money's coming from outside, but the food's going somewhere else, is that going to mean putting more into the system like food processing?
Yeah, I do think it's pretty darn important. I think Lon mentioned the slaughterhouses in the 6 counties, the fact that there are 0. And so that, right, in itself, you can't really grow protein and get it in a way that you could legally market it without a USDA slaughterhouse. Just doesn't happen. And even Fred Manis did one locally here, but he's struggling to get the labor to run it. And so there's a months and months backlog. And so I think to some extent, absolutely, right? How can we invest in these local communities to make sure that there are the processes there? I like Erin's point about rewarding that entrepreneurial spirit, right? I hear policies and I'm like, there always are side effects, right? We're an organic farm. Nitrates in the soil, I'm not a fan, right? Madison has terrible water as a result. And, I grew up in Esparto High and the water is no good there, or was no good there, over application of nitrates. Great, all kinds of laws and policies where we have to monitor and regulate it. But now, like an organic farm who's not putting on nitrates, right? We have to go through all this paperwork and it's a real pain in the butt. And so I think there's always two sides to any coin. But in the end, yes, while the economics may not always support it, having that community is always going to be essential to be that overflow valve when something happens. And I think we do have a great community here, and we need to consider how to continue to invest in that. And maybe that is just some finer points, like getting a way to process protein more locally, or some of the small things.
Well, and in general, what economies that have kind of these tradable clusters that you can, again, is there something to be said here, Lon or Erin, about if we're able to invest more in the system as a whole, and whether that is food processing, whether that is distribution channels or similar, I mean, that does come with, I'm going to guess, some jobs, let alone the impact, for our climate and our economy and our transportation systems and similar. To your point, Erin, are there other, well-intended impacts that can come out of that by strengthening the food system that's around many of our growers?
Yeah, I mean, I think my perspective is that there's no easy answers here, and so I'm certainly, I think, loath to give to try to give those. And there's a question in the chat about maybe you were going to bring this up later, Erica. But
please, Erin, go for it.
It matches what I'm about to say, that monopolistic practices among processors would hurt farmers like Freeman, and leading to a loss of local connections and other things that we value. And I think that's exactly right. And that antitrust is a big policy issue in the food system. And so, if we think that sort of that is the problem, that there's sort of downstream food processing firms have just gotten too big and gotten too much power, then figuring out ways to dissipate that power is a major policy focus. And then some of these other benefits that we've talked about might follow on from that. So I think it's tough to think about exactly what kinds of regulations might help, because as Freeman said, often well-intentioned regulations, such as, for example, nitrate regulations and environmental regulations, which are hugely important and may be beneficial overall for society, also tend to put a much larger burden on smaller producers, because if you're a big enough operation, you can employ someone to take care of all that paperwork. If you're a smaller operation, you've got to figure out how to do it yourself, along with all the other things you're trying to do. And so, so I think that's often why you see small businesses might be pushing back against environmental regulation. It's not that they don't care. It's just that it takes us away from them actually being able to operate their business. And so, I'm always wary of, imposing some policy that then is going to potentially impose a bunch of costs on people, and then maybe be self-defeating, or at least have these other costs for smaller producers. I do think the one other aspect that where there is optimism, and it's a little bit connected to something I think Lon was saying earlier, is technology. I mean, we've seen massive agricultural productivity growth over the last few decades, and I think continuing to invest in that productivity growth and where it's and I think it's we can think about where that productivity growth might come from, and we've seen a revolution certainly throughout the world in many sectors of the economy on data analysis of data, artificial intelligence with data, all of these sort of new technologies that are now finding their way into agriculture. And, I think it's a little bit sort of the Wild West in that world at the moment, where there's a lot of people out there with products that they're trying to sell, and there's a lot of people developing things that potentially are going to be very helpful. One thing I think that could be promising in this area is that digital technologies, unlike things, like tomato harvesters or sort of big pieces of capital equipment that we had to buy as farmers to increase productivity, those are expensive. So you need to be big enough just to be able to afford to buy the harvester or the big piece of capital equipment in order to operate it. Some of the newer sort of digital solutions that are not sort of big things that you need to buy. They're things that maybe where you can be, paying for a service, or it's things where so the marginal cost of delivering that piece of sort of software assistance to say the producer, to whether it's something to monitor irrigation, or something to monitor fertilizer use, or it's something to sort of manage sort of supply chains or inventory or all kinds of things. Those are potentially things that wouldn't be high costs and require big investments from producers, and they may be things that can help smaller producers to be able to increase efficiency without the red tape. And I think that's an area where I see significant promise in the future.
Maybe some innovation process, Aaron, it sounds like, too, for paperwork.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And Erica, I would just add to what Aaron had just said, that for example, the data collection and traceability of how something is produced from the field to the table, that helps on the marketing side as well too. And Freeman can speak to this. It's like going back to the labeling of organic. What does organic mean? Is that a distinctive value to the consumer? It was. That's why people were willing to pay a little higher amount for it. But now we're looking at other things like sustainability and other taglines. I was just I serve on the University of California President's Advisory Commission on Ag and Natural Resources, and we had a meeting this morning. And the president was most interested in this whole area of regenerative agriculture. And that's another tagline and that consumers are looking at. What does that actually mean? Is that value to what you're consuming? And with more information that's available that Aaron is mentioning, maybe it will be. And that may drive local consumption and local demand, as well as local production. So the technology is there to allow us to do it. It's how we implement it and utilize it is really the answer.
I couldn't agree more. My parents started organic and nobody knew what it meant. They're like, oh, it's got carbon. Of course it's organic. And so what we view kind of our role is kind of taking that next step. And that really is information, right? Connecting people to understand where it's grown and just give them a choice. And so the technology is going to be absolutely essential to, and it's what really powered our ability to do what we've done, right? Connect to all these individual customers. But even if you're just at the store and you can scan the apple and understand more about the farm and where it came from, at least the retailer isn't able to control what the consumer sees. And that's been the case, right? And still kind of is the case for ingredients within products. The consumer just can't see where it comes from. So then how can they make an educated choice? And you know, being able to be more transparent and get that information in front of consumers is really exciting and can at least help those who want to make that choice right? But to Lon's point, there's this whole other point, right? I'm always marketing to those who can afford to pay more and willing to put a little bit more into that, you know, and there is just this whole other question about, well, you know, just because you have a little more disposable income, then you're able to eat local and have those connections. What about everybody else? And I think that's a real point and topic that needs to be addressed.
Well, maybe, and Freeman, I am a proud subscriber to a Farm Fresh to You produce box. You know, we as a family, we talk through with the kids, like, what do you want to order this week? And what is it? And what are we going to make in our food? And that is a luxury we have. But there are a lot of families out there that don't have that luxury, or they are reliant on their food from school districts and similar. So it's as much as I think you are a great example of, and for many of our small business owners, they've had to wear the marketing hat and the accounting hat and the HR hat, right? But from, again, going back to a sustainable community, what as a country, I think 40% of our food is wasted. So the impact both on economy, families, communities, equity, sustainability, and similar, you know, what are the opportunities that we have? And I think we're seeing this more and more in the innovation, the technology side of it, Aaron, of, you know, we are finding new and different uses for food products and things that are coming from our ag community, whether it's making sure that every single part of something that's being produced, grown, whatever that might become, whether it's coming from, again, our dairy industries, our produce industries, whatever it might be, you know, getting more out of that product. Is this, again, where innovation can lead us into new opportunities, especially for our local region?
I think so, yeah. And there's certainly groups within the AIC for the food system who are thinking specifically about food waste and technology solutions there. And you know, and the reason we have so much sort of you know, food and maybe food loss is a better term than food waste, because, you know, sometimes there's going to be produce that goes bad because maybe it was a little too ripe when it was harvested, or for whatever reason, or it wasn't stored appropriately through the system. So sometimes it's I guess stuff that may be you know, inevitable. Sometimes it's just people, you know, taking too much, you know, eyes bigger than the stomach, as my mother used to say, and then not finishing what's on their plate. And so there's a lot of complex issues there, ranging from efficiencies within the supply chain to avoid spoilage in processing and in grocery stores. That's certainly a big chunk of it. There's also sort of human behavior aspects, which are much harder to think about sort of regulating and changing. Just, you know, those restaurants have an incentive often to offer a big serving, and people may not eat all of it, but that helps to bring customers through the door. And, you know, I think just as humans, often we overload our plate. And so that's also a part of that system. And maybe technological solutions are a little bit harder to think about in you know, at the very final sort of step in the food chain as to, you know, what's on the plate. But there's opportunities, I think, throughout to, you know, essentially it comes down to lowering the cost of so, you know, right now, you know, often we'll discard food because that's the lowest cost thing to do with it. So if you can lower the cost of being able to do something else with it, whether turning it into or keeping it as some other nutritious food product or something like that, then I think that's worth doing. And I should also say that, you know, some of the food that's wasted, or maybe a significant portion of it, you know, goes to feed animals. And so it's not completely lost to the food system, maybe in the way that we, you know, we might think when you think sort of food waste, you think it's all going into landfill.
Freeman, what, in the big picture, what would incentivize, you feel, growers like yourself, and especially more of our small businesses, in order to continue to make that connection locally? Is it just the ability to market more where the food comes from, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like the food waste thing, I love that statement about, the lowest cost thing to do, right? Because, sustainable farmers, my mom always used to say, well, if you're not making anything, you're not sustainable, because you're not going to be around next year. And so I think that in the end is the bottom line, right? We need to be aware that it's a challenging industry, and I see, like, even California is a great place for local, but there is a lot of pressure. Arizona has just cheaper labor. A lot of stuff is going to Mexico. We see it every year. It's like more and more goes there, and those who are going there are the only ones kind of growing their market share, right? And so I just think keeping a finger on the pulse on the local community, and continuing to make sure small producers are supported and not going away in significant numbers is going to be important, and raise the alarm if it happens, because it is an important thing to have, I think, even keeping in mind kind of as the relief valve, as part of some of those finer points of the local community.
Freeman, do you think part of this, especially for our local ag community, is it access to capital, so you can build in some of these innovations and these efficiencies? If it's introducing new technology or similar, are those things that would help to create more predictability, sustainability for some of our growers?
I genuinely do not think that's it. For example, if somebody gave me $10 million and said, hey, I need you to make 2% on this 10 million, invest away, I wouldn't have any great ideas, right? It would just terrify me. It's like, oh my goodness. And that's the challenge. It's really about the price, right? It's about the price they can get for that product. And the realities of the economies of scale are very low in this kind of local, less specialized, really cool. This painting in the back's looking over my shoulder. Really diverse stuff all coming from our farm, but it's hard to be the best fig grower out there when you only have a handful of acres, right? Just the management and getting out there and making sure you're there, and the post-harvest cooling, it really is a challenge. And so I think, focusing on a place where local growers can get a premium price, that's going to be probably the most important thing. Maybe that is, investments in capital that are then some kind of hub that then delivers it with some kind of economy of scale. I don't want to be too blanketed in my statement, but I think that really comes down to it. And as a small local farm, right, we're all about building that network with our consumers. Yes, with other producers, and models like ours is important, but those consumers are always with us day in, day out, kind of willing to pay a little bit extra because they understand the why, right? They get that connection, and it's a feel-good thing that I think does serve a greater purpose.
Aaron, and we're seeing, one of the great kind of new things that was launched this past summer is AgStart. So we have a shortage of wet labs in the region, which really tie back to the opportunities for some of that innovation, both for ag, for life sciences, and similar different ways to create food products. And along those lines, is the creation of essentially kind of more wet labs, more AgStart, does that provide more opportunities as well to kind of grow and scale some of our local economies that are tied to ag?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak specifically to AgStart, but that's, I think, sounds like an example of the kinds of things that could be very beneficial. So if, and I think it's an important it's I think among the better uses for public funding is in research and development, and I think both of those parts are important. So the research, the lab research on improving all dimensions of food production and agricultural production, and sort of often that development phase also sometimes is important of sort of figuring out how can we take this technology that works in a lab and actually translate it to the field to get to generate these benefits for producers and for consumers. So yeah, I do think just in general, I mean, and this is true across other sectors of the economy too. It's clearly true in thinking about adaptation to climate change that I think investment in research and development of new technologies is really important.
And I do want to revise my statement a little bit. What Aaron said, like growing 20 different crops and having something that can weed that effectively, without a lot of input, right? I just take the machine out there and it executes. And then we're moving from broccoli to lettuce to tomatoes, and I'm not recalibrating it and dealing with that. That could be a game changer. And small farms aren't going there. And that's obviously a huge capital intensive type thing. But that is a really big deal that is very contrary to my previous statement about sales. So I do think there is, back to technology, things that can really help diversified producers do it a lot more efficiently through technology, through R&D.
Yeah, and I really like that example. I think because I think that's one thing we can potentially see through technologies is an ability to decommodify things a little bit, and so older technologies, it's like you run your harvester through it can grab all of the tomatoes that are of a certain size and shape, and those are the ones that we will be producing, whereas a smarter technology can be more nuanced, and it can weed different types of fields or whatever the application is, and so it allows you to operate as though you're at a sort of a bigger scale. It allows Freeman to operate as though he's got one crop across his whole farm rather than many different crops, because the technology is able to adapt to what it's seeing. So I think that is one real big potential advantage of sort of our next generation technologies.
And Eric, if I could just add, I was just over at the Ag Start Labs yesterday, and I've been involved with them for a number of years. But more importantly, on a very positive note, I'm also part of the team looking at the feasibility of creating a California Ag, Food, and Health Innovation Center here in Northern California, aligned with much of the work that Aaron is doing at UC Davis and just generally through the UC system. So that's a possibility that through a government grant, the Build Back Better, we put a grant application in just yesterday. So there's promising opportunities on the technology side for our region, but can benefit not only the companies evolving and the producers evolving here, but even on a global scale.
Lon, can you expand a little bit more on kind of what you were hoping will come out of that whether it's an institute or similar that you're talking about? I think we've heard a lot of, well, Silicon Valley is where the entrepreneurs are, and they're creating all these great innovations for all the use and the growers and the ag industry that's here. Is this going to connect the dots better? What are you hoping that will do?
Yes, I mean, I think that's one aspect of a clearinghouse of all the best practices that are being currently developed. It's also going to be an incubator for new and evolving companies within the region. But more importantly, we're looking at practical applications of the technology that comes out. That's one of the things that I think are missing from all of these other incubators around the world, is how does the technology that's being created being utilized by farmers like Freeman? How do you actually get it into the field and to make them more efficient? So that's really the critical component of this innovation center that we think will distinguish it from anything else around the world. And what better place to do it than here in Northern California? We're again the epicenter of food production and the diversity of food production that can't be done anywhere else. And again, I emphasize the point that Aaron made to begin our overall discussion. If we can't do it in California, where are you going to do it?
Well, and maybe to a degree, that is maybe one of the best examples of growing the local economies, correct? This is a way of taking what we do highest and best with the background of an incredible research institution, educational institution, UC Davis, right here in Yolo County, and essentially taking that application, which in the big picture means that Freeman, as the business owner, can get more food and can do it more efficiently. Is that not to say if you were going to create a cycle? Is that what it's looking like?
Yeah, I think that's one aspect of it. That's an important aspect of it. The question is, how do we produce food for this globe in the 22nd century? That's really the critical issue that we've got to start thinking about now. And I think we have the technologies. We just have to apply them in the most practical way.
What else is needed in order to, I think we can all agree that with innovation comes efficiencies, can come more sustainability and similar, but what else is needed in this, again, food system to support that? We talk about workforce, if you're using a new technology, sometimes the workforce isn't trained to do it. What else needs to support the food system in order to make some of those innovations come alive?
Well, I think you've already addressed part of that. You talked about capital investment is critical to that. An educated workforce to implement the new technologies. It can't be the ag workers of the past. And I think that's already evolving. I know Freeman can point to that too, that they're utilizing things that they never would have utilized in the field just a few years ago. And so you just need to have, and again, to the point Aaron made earlier, we're more efficient now. We may not need as many people in the field as we did before. So those are all evolving, and we can certainly play a major part in how that's developed for the future.
Freeman, are you sensing that there is a lot has been, I think, focused on the role that farmers and growers play and how important they are, just not to our food system, but to our local culture. Many of these obviously family businesses, I think our region especially have long been owned and run by minority-owned businesses over the years, and been part of that culture as well. Are you sensing a greater interest that sometimes when there's innovation and other things going on, that more and more people are looking at getting involved in ag and wanting to be a part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, on a hard working farm, right? My parents were kind of hippies, UC Davis, grad school, and my dad wanted to change the world, start a farmer's market, and was worried there wasn't enough produce. And so, I always kind of view, small farming as the toil that it often is, right? My mom struggling to make payroll. That's my childhood, right? Shoes with holes in them. And so it's hard because it really is a hard business. You have to love it, right? You have to love it and get into it. So I don't really have a huge sense on like how many people are pouring into it. I have this, come talk to me if you're interested, right? And I'll give you, some reasons maybe to consider all sides. But you talk about the infrastructure, and one thing that we don't really think about here in Yolo County too is not only are our small businesses doing all the paperwork and the marketing and the growing, but if you think about us compared to say Salinas, we're also the post-harvest crew, right? We have our own coolers. We're bringing temps down on our own product. We're shipping the product. And even, in Salinas, right, there's businesses that do nothing but cool product, and they're really good at that. And then suddenly, as a farmer of fresh veg, I'm not worried about that. I just grow the product, and I could almost even work with a specialty group outside to get harvested and somebody else to cool it. And then that gets it to a distributor for distribution, right? And then I can really just focus on my own product. And so I think there's just a lot of pieces here, understanding really where do we want to go? Because I think any one of these avenues, there are some right next steps if we wanted to get there.
How do you guys feel that, and one of the questions we have is, as innovations evolve, a lot of times we have good intentions, and you have those unintended consequences. How do we ensure that these practices remain culturally relevant and responsive, and ultimately are helping improve the lives of the communities they're trying to support?
That's a good question, and it has a lot of layers in it. So I'll see if I can address a couple of them. I think the first thing is that food, more than most sort of things that we use or consume, I think has a very sort of emotional connection to us. It's sort of inherent to our humanity. I mean, we have, comfort foods as a thing that, we might want to have, and everyone has slightly different comfort foods that are probably at least somewhat connected to the environment where they grew up, or culture, or other things. And so there's a lot that surrounds the way that we consume food that's different from, a notepad or something, which, we probably don't care as much where our notepad comes from. And so I think that is where the opportunity is for smaller producers who might be producing products that are not commoditized, that people place value on having something that they know where it's come from, they know it's come from nearby, and that's something that's valued to them and means something to them, over and above the fact that this is just a piece of spinach, that it has more sort of value. And so being able to connect people to be able to consume that food that gives them pleasure is what Freeman's doing in his business. And so to the extent that we can enable that in society, I think that's great. So the barriers that prevent businesses from being able to do that, I think, are things that we should look at and see how we can remove them, and how technologies can improve them. And in terms of equity, I think as Freeman was saying, typically people are going to be buying, say, delivered farm fresh products at a higher price than they might if they went down to the local grocery store and bought something. And I think that's fine. I think that arrangement in Salinas that Freeman talked about, where there are people who have come up with their own business idea to be cooling product as it comes off the field. I mean, that's great. More power to them. And then that's supplying also, available food at low cost to people. And so, I think we shouldn't sort of think about one thing to the exclusion of the other. And, if we're thinking, because people have lots of different preferences about their food and what matters to them. For some people, they're in an economic situation where the thing that matters most is sort of calories per dollar, and how can I get the calories I need to feed my family at the lowest possible cost, and they're served by by different set of production than maybe those who are able to spend a little bit more to sort of indulge in things that do give us pleasure, because we all have things about food that we like, or that we're emotionally attached to, and that's something to celebrate, I think, as humans, rather than something to something to celebrate. So I think that's part of it. In terms more generally of innovations and thinking about artificial intelligence, I mean, I think there's potentially a lot of ethical issues to think about, and that's a big part, in fact, of the work that I've been involved with at the AI Institute for the Food System. So we're one big issue is, and a lot, I think, of what sort of modern technologies are doing is they're working with data. And where does that data come from? Well, it comes from people, maybe from farmers or producers or consumers. And so, how are those data being handled, and how are they being used? And are we as a technology producer or an artificial intelligence producer, are you producing things that are sort of beneficial to society or harmful to society? And so those are all issues that are important to think about, and that we are sort of working on to set up a culture, at least within our institute at Davis, to be mindful of those issues. And often I think they can be sort of swept aside in the rush to sell some new shiny technology tool.
Erica, can I also add to that as well? We live in the most culturally diverse state in the country. probably the most culturally diverse region in the world. And I think the market will hopefully bear that to be the case as we continue to diversify. I mean, we're a majority, non-majority state now in terms of our ethnic makeup. And so the market demands of those communities will certainly drive what's produced in the food. And I think we're seeing that already in some of our markets, but as we talk about technology evolving and becoming more efficient, we certainly will need to continue to produce not only for the demands of our market, our diverse market in California, but hopefully meeting the demands of other diverse markets in Latin America and Asia and even Africa. And so hopefully that's reflected in the type of production we'll be engaged in and will continue to be engaged in. We already are, but I think that will continue to evolve.
Well, and maybe on that note, and I don't know, Freeman, you can speak to this the best of, I think something we are finding more often than not, especially for many of our cultural communities, sometimes it's a matter of listening, right? We I think for some elements, we are making assumptions or driving solutions, right? Without that engagement with the community or that input, and to a degree, we've talked a lot about what the consumer wants and supply demand. How are industries, whether it's, and Freeman, to a point, even with your own, the folks that you engage with, your customers, how are you hearing and listening what is important to them and what they want to see in their food?
Yeah, no, we live and breathe that. And that's what has created, our home delivery business, is the ability to interact with tens of thousands of customers and listen to them and process that information. And to some extent kind of cater to those who want our product, right? And so I think that's the challenge, right? When we think about that is we as a business gravitate to those who can afford our service, and then we listen to them, and we're kind of in our own little echo chamber pushing this certain segment. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of accessibility of local to everybody, and understanding how to get there. And there's great programs that we do, right? Sponsoring a box, or when customers are on vacation, taking those boxes and delivering them to food banks every week or whatever system. And it always ramps up through the holidays. So I think there's some good things about that, but I really appreciate this panel at a macro level, because I think there's still a lot of work to be done. How to do that, I think, is proving to be quite tricky with all the policies and unintended consequences, and money better spent, potentially better spent. How do we best spend these dollars, because they're real dollars? But it's exciting to be a part of it, and I think technology has been how we got here and could be a huge piece of this next chapter.
Maybe as we kind of look in these final minutes, and again, I want to ask our audience if there's any questions you have for our panel to include them in the chat while we still have them. But maybe just this, all of you live and breathe this every day. Where, as we look to how we can better support a sustainable, kind of equitable local food system, where are you seeing anywhere in the world where, not to say like they are a best case example, or have found ways to really better integrate, whether it's the networks or the policies or whatever that might look like? Is there anything you can speak to that, as we kind of look internally, we might be able to also look at some best studies externally? Or do we just need to be the trendsetters here and do it ourselves?
Well, we can certainly borrow from best practices globally. They do a great job of local production in many European countries. The Dutch have done a fantastic job in their expertise in growing in very small areas, and certainly controlled environment agriculture has been a growing area of production. We can also look to the efficiencies even in Asian countries as well too. The diversity that they've shown there, and their ability to maximize production, especially places like Japan and Korea. where they have less arable land, but have done a good job of focusing their government policies on agriculture production. So we can live and learn, but again, we are at the focal point of what can be done in even a better way here in California. So we need to lead. We don't need to follow, we need to lead, and we need to lead through policy development. I think we see some changes in that happening. Not only buy local issues, which have positive, not necessarily all positive effects, but for example, just this year, Governor Newsom just signed into law a new bill supporting food hubs throughout California for the first time. So that's another commitment to local production that we hadn't seen before. So that's just a step in the right direction.
Aaron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add maybe one anecdote about policy. So as I mentioned earlier, I think I grew up in New Zealand, a farm that was predominantly sheep. And back in sort of the 1970s and before, the New Zealand government basically paid farmers to own sheep. So you can guess what farmers did. They owned a lot of sheep. And that worked for a while because New Zealand was a major exporter that would send product mostly to the UK. And then, the world changed as it does, and the UK got more connected with Europe, and that market kind of dried up, and New Zealand was left with a whole bunch of sheep and other macroeconomic issues. And so what the government sort of did at that time, essentially, as part of a lot of other economic reforms, it just said no more subsidies for farmers. It's just like you're on your own. And when I talked to my dad about this, he's like, that was the best thing ever. Right? Everyone was worried that farmers were all going to go bankrupt and the world was going to end. But, the way he sees it is he went from having this sort of, your entire business was focused on how do I maximize what I can get from the government to how can I actually, produce something that people want to buy. And so, I don't mean to diminish policy because there's a lot of really important policy issues that need to be addressed. But I also think that it's worth remembering also, it sort of goes back to the dynamism. And I mean, I think that the people who choose to go into agriculture are special people who are maybe willing to take some risks and to work hard and they love doing what they're doing. And so you want to at least be enabling people to be able to follow that. And so and so I think, it's, as I said, there's a lot of potential places where policy can be important, certainly in environmental areas with antitrust issues and other things like that. But I always sort of take that step back and think, well, sometimes if we have too much policy involvement, then we sort of we suppress what in fact is the thing that we're trying to encourage, which is that dynamism of sort of a local set of producers.
Yeah, and let me add my apologies to Aaron's New Zealand farmers, because when I was a trade policy leading for the United States government, the best partners were the New Zealanders because of the free market aspect. And he's absolutely correct. It's when you don't implement government policy and get out of the way and let the farmers do what they can do best is often is the best policy present. So I completely agree with him that New Zealand is a great example of what can be done if you let the government step out of the way and let farmers do what they do best.
Well, Freeman, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of thoughts. Regulation is real, right? And there's a lot of regulation in California. So it's just kind of the way of doing business here. But I do like this concept of just stepping back on my capital comment again. Those who really do have a passion for this, oftentimes don't have the money to get it going. And I'm seeing USDA has crop insurance, right? It was never available for mixed crop farmers, and they started a pilot program. Now it is, and now they're releasing one for folks that up to 100,000 or something. Not a lot of sales, but something. And so I think for those who are really passionate, how do we give them the ability to get into this and give it a go and have a spot? Because even now it's not like you can just get into farmers markets, right? There's waiting lists, et cetera. and it's not like you can just create more farmers markets because customers have tons of places to go. So they're not going to work there. And so, understanding how we can support this entrepreneurial spirit of people who want to get into farming, I do think that that is an important aspect. And as we fuel this next generation of farmers.
Well, and certainly there's organizations like Soulborn. There's been, I think a lot of communities are trying to do, even community gardens just to start as a place for people to learn and to be engaged with other farmers on what it takes. I think there's examples of this in especially many cultural communities of bringing people back to your point, Aaron, the food they grew up with and loved and things that remind them of home and the ability to grow it. And I think, Lon, you touched upon this as well. There is some funding now for some of these kind of food hubs, food resiliency hubs that are meant to also be a place to kind of encourage the craft, if you will, of it and the opportunities that come with it. So maybe in these last 4 minutes that we've got here, if there was one thing, if you had a magic wand and there is one thing you could do to help support to make our local food system be more equitable and sustainable after all we've talked about in these 2 hours, what would that be? And Aaron, I think I'm going to start with you.
Oh, I drew the short straw. One thing.
That's what you get for traveling the longest distance.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I partly because I don't know if there is a one thing, but I would say that whatever we do to focus on what it is about localness that's valuable, and then direct policy towards that. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, Lon.
I agree with Aaron. There's not one thing. The one thing that I think is we would be pandemic free so we could do the session in person. I would appreciate it being with these wonderful gentlemen and yourself, and at least seeing the audience in person would have been nice to interact. But all kidding aside, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to expand already resources we have available in this community and make them available in an equitable way, not only for those that can pay for it, but those that can't. And that's really the key for food production, right? We want to make sure that everybody is sufficiently fed.
Absolutely. And Freeman, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have one thing, but I do appreciate this panel and just being here and listening to the ideas, because for me, I'm kind of living and breathing the business and I have my head in my world, right? And so I think continuing to have this dialogue of ideas and, at some point formulating them into something actionable and getting consensus or enough consensus to drive what we're really after. I do appreciate that. So, I guess just to continue to push for the things that are dear to us is really important. And I think forums like this are a great piece to that.
Certainly start to the conversation that will hopefully inspire some action beyond this, not just with this panel. So for our audience, we really want to thank you for joining us for this panel and talking about, again, our local economies, how it relates to our ag community, as well as how we can make it more sustainable and equitable. With this, I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. We hope that you will take from this. And again, if you have questions, follow-ups for any of our panelists, by all means, contact Yola County Food Bank. I'm sure that they will have some resources for you in addition. But again, I think to what all of us said here, the conversation does not end here. And hopefully the next time we pick it up, we will do it in person with a local beer in hand, maybe, and some local food in front of us and good people. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thank you again to our panelists for being here today.